last formal session of the day, border control. Hi, Sonali. This session was the vision of Steve Klemenchik. As many of you may know, Steve is considered one of the foremost authorities on CFIUS in the world today, having recently brought his practice group from PwC to Ankara. And we greatly appreciate the support of Ankara in this conversation. We have a late addition to this panel, Cesar Enquilar. Cesar, you may know, one of the foremost cross-border deal makers across the Atlantic between the United States and the UK. And Sonali, you have your hands full with this group. I wish you all the luck.
I'm Sonali Basic. I report on investment banking for Bloomberg News. The panel today that we have is going to be talking about cross-border deal making. Have we had everybody introduced? Or
no, I think
Steve Klemenchik, as you know, works for Ankara and is a foremost expert on CFIUS, among other things. We have Farhad Jalinas, who is the partner and chair of national security at White & Case, the law firm. Then we have Claudia Iannazzo, right? And she is a managing partner and co-founder of Alpha Prime Ventures. Cesar Enquilar, who's the chairman and CEO of Winchester Capital. We have Nicholas Assef, the principal and founder of LCC Asia Pacific, and Ewan Relly, the co-founder and managing partner of BDA.
You're so good at this, Sonali, you should be a reporter.
Yes, and that's what I do. I report on investment banking issues where cross-border deal making lately is something everyone's talking about, trade and regulation, which is where I think we can start today's panel. You know, because we have a CFIUS expert on our panel. Maybe that may be a good. We have a lot of CFIUS experts on our panel. That might be a good place to start, given the tone that we've seen out of Washington. You know, how are we seeing? How prohibitive can we see regulation becoming, and how that's impacting cross-border deal flow?
So I'll take a start at that. How prohibitive can it be? As prohibitive as the president wants to make it. He has all the authority he needs in the law to step in, and national security is his purview. You know, like it or not, regardless of the politics, the fact of the matter is he has the ability to step into the process whenever he wants to step into the process. You saw that play out with Qualcomm, and there was a bit of an uproar about, well, he didn't follow the process, you know, the review process. He stepped in out of cycle. It's his cycle. People need to understand that, and I'm not sure everybody does. The law is written in such a way that there is a review process to follow, but if it's the president's review process, and if he wants to step into the middle of it and short circuit it, it is well within his rights to do that, and there's nobody who can, people complain about it, but there's not a lot you can do about it. So where is the law going? There is a new law that's coming out. It's an update to the current CFIUS law, which is called the Foreign Investment National Security Act. Came out in 2007, I think it was. The new law is the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRMA, which updates CFIUS. So you think about CFIUS as 10 years old. There is technology that's being batted around now that wasn't even in existence, wasn't even conceived of 10 years ago. And so that's a concern. That's one of the concerns about why the law came about. You know, you look at things like AI, you look at things, you know, Bitcoin, the evolution of fintech. All of these things weren't even an issue 10 years ago. And now some of them have very real national security implications. So the law in the United States, it's being redefined. There's still a process behind it that'll be followed, some adjustments to it, but we can get into the discussions of whether you think it's more restrictive or less as the day goes on.
So, given that we expect a degree of this becoming more restrictive, you and maybe you can pitch in here and contribute to how that's very tangibly translating into deal flow.
It's tangibly translating into deals not happening more than into deal flow. I think it's I agree with Steve, of course, it's the president's right. I think there is some uncertainty at the moment and some concern. And most graphically for us at BDA, we're seeing Chinese investors much less keen even to try for obvious reasons. I think there's been a pretty clear message that Chinese investment isn't particularly welcome in the US at the moment, and I won't take any view as to whether that's appropriate or not. what is meant has been that Chinese investment has been redirected towards Europe, and that other, from what we see, other Asian investors are becoming more aggressive in the US, notably Japanese is the number one. And the Japanese are quite consciously filling the gap, I think, left by Chinese nervousness. I would imagine Chinese investors will come back. I think US interests require Chinese investment in the longer term, but I think for the next couple of years, the Chinese are going to have to be quiet, and the Japanese and the Europeans will be more aggressive in the US as a result, I suppose.
I'm wondering also, Farhad, are you seeing any kind of other restrictions for foreign buyers in the US from a regulatory perspective?
In the U.S.?
In the US, do you see anything limiting deal flow inbound or even outbound, actually?
No. I mean, look. I mean, it's CFIUS. There is certainly CFIUS, which is at the forefront of everybody's mind, and I think that I do agree that it is something that there's a keen level of attention on what is going on with the committee, how the law is going to be changed over the next few months, and very importantly, how the regulations that are going to implement the law are going to be drafted up and ultimately going to go into effect, because there's a lot of the language in the law that differs to the key provisions that have to be sorted out in the regulatory framework. I do agree. You know, there is certainly a sense that there is a trend that started maybe a couple of years ago with the control transactions, the mega control transactions out of China, now sort of slowing down and stepping back to see how this is going to develop. I think that frankly, under this new law, and mind you, this is the DC regulatory lawyer speaking, right? So for me, this is going to add a layer of clarity, and there's going to add a additional layer of process that I think frankly it's going to be quite advantageous for cross-border deals. I think that we're going to see a lot of restructuring and focus on private equity as being a U.S. private equity, as being a vehicle for inbound investment in some of these countries and in some of these areas that are clearly of concern to the government. As Steve said, there are certainly a level of technology that we are talking about that was just non-existent in 2007 when FINSA was passed. This is autonomous driving, machine learning, artificial intelligence, a whole lot of things that is going to now be driven by the race towards who's going to win the 5G race, which is going to be very much at the center of all this, and it's going to be largely a focus of the U.S. government as they look at these things. But also another thing that has happened is that deal structures have started getting more complex and complicated, and there's more. You look at a flow diagram of a private equity, and you have to explain that to a series of national security regulators in Washington who need to understand this and need to get comfortable with where the control is coming. And I think that has been part of the challenge as well.
Right. So I'm in private equity, and what Alpha Prime does is we focus on investing in emerging security technologies. So we live this issue day in, day out. I think in terms of Chinese investors wanting economic exposure to US security companies, of course I'm biased, but I would say actually economic exposure can be satisfied by investing in venture capital and private equity. The control issue, we have actually seen foreign investors get a little bit more innovative about the path. So they can still get control, visibility, data rights by being an investor in an Israeli company that invests in a US company. Or alternatively, they invest in an Israeli company that has access to US data. So the issue for us in private equity and venture capital is to try to work out what is going to be considered sensitive technology. And I know the regulations are actually being broadened so that this can evolve as time and technologies evolve. But I'll give you a really good example of something that 10 years ago, nobody thought having visibility of the data set in Facebook was going to be a national security issue, but it is. So I'm a little skeptical, with the greatest of respect to folks from DC, that
so are we.
that administrators are going to be able to understand and wrap their heads around the complexity of this, because the data flows are occurring so quickly. Where do you draw the line? So in hindsight, we look back and we say, Facebook bad, right? Do you ban Chinese investment in Facebook? I personally think that's a bridge too far. Where do you stand on Cambridge Analytica? And where does that cascade end? So I'm just not sure that these regulations are going to have the impact of actually getting the position that the US government is after, which is certain, considered relatively unfriendly countries not having access and visibility and intellectual property rights to US technology. And then there's the second issue, we're talking about investing in the US. US technology trying to do business in China has to voluntarily submit to this regime anyway. There's the Chinese have a US cyber sovereignty law. If you want to export or operate in China, you must submit your source code to the Chinese government, and they have a copy of it. They're not the only ones in the region that are taking this approach. I totally understand why they're taking it, so that they can have full control and visibility as to what's going on within China. But any US company wanting to expand into Asia has to submit themselves to it. So I think CIFRIS is one avenue of control, but it's you could have CIFRIS as a perfect sphere, a perfect loop with perfect control, and there are so many other ways for these countries to get access to this data set that you kind of sit there and go, well, is it really worth the amount of paperwork?
Did we think about that?
A point that Farhad brought up that I really enjoyed was the idea of investors getting access to the U.S. market in ways that are not direct deals through private equity. I'm wondering, and this is an open question for the panelists, are you seeing more different types of investors? Are you seeing more sovereign wealth funds, more family offices, rather than strategics being more competitive in deals?
Absolutely. I mean, the scope of I started doing CFIUS work 25 years ago, and in the old days, it was energy and defense deals. It was the strategic players that would come from Western Europe at the time in Canada. And now what you see is there's a lot of capital around the world.
Where is it coming from?
That's right. And it's all looking for solid, good investment. And a good bit of it is really looking for the economic returns, but there are protections that they are looking to have because these are big swaths of money that have to be deployed. So we are seeing, right now, certainly there's been a shift in the practice, and not only at White and Case, but I'm pretty sure that it's across the board with all CFIUS lawyers, where the split is much more even between private equity and strategic investors than it used to be. And in fact, what is also happening a lot right now is that there's more focus now on advisory work where you are structuring deals in a way that can either make them CFIUS friendly or structure them in a way that arguably does not trigger CFIUS's jurisdiction, so that you don't have to go through the process. There's got to be a level of risk tolerance with that, because at some level, it's national security. CFIUS can find jurisdiction if they really look for it somewhere. But
do you find that who's the most innovative in coming up with these structures? I mean, I know private equity we have our playbook. Do you find private equity is more innovative than strategics?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're financial minds, so they're always thinking about. I can tell you that this is one of those diagrams that we're talking about. They're not getting simpler over the years, right? They're just getting more and more complex and more rigorous. But to your point, I mean, part of the challenge of that is you've got to be able to convince. If the government takes an interest in a transaction and is looking to see where control is coming from, whether it's direct control or really what is more sensitive from my perspective is indirect control or influence. You got to be able to really try to decipher that diagram and give them comfort based on the documentation and everything that you're putting in front of them, that at the end of the day, who we're saying is the GP is really the person who is in control and not the investors through the different mechanisms. They may have negative veto rights and things like that, but it's not real control.
Well, we've seen it's an issue of trust. The committee has got to be able to trust you in what you're saying is true and accurate and properly portrayed. And they're going to look to try to make sure that is in fact the case. There's a very fair question you raised about, are they capable of doing that? And that's a very valid point, but that doesn't mean they're not going to try. To Ewan's point, he's seeing Chinese investors move into Europe. That carries its own level of risk with it as well, because in addition to CFIUS, which we can get back to in a second, a lot of European companies and the EU are all starting to look at foreign investment review regimes and making them tighter and stronger, more restrictive. But the other thing that has been lost in a couple of cases that have come back to bite the buyer is the fact that European industry and U.S. industry are so closely intertwined that it's oftentimes, if you want to buy a sophisticated company in Europe, he's going to have operations in the United States. And when that happens, CFIUS has jurisdiction over the case.
We've had two people on the panel already mention that there may be more deals coming out of China into Europe instead. I mean, is there a real fear that, that attraction will pull some deal flow away from the U.S.? Are there enough opportunities in Europe or anywhere else in the world that can be a distraction really from the U.S. market, given what the CFIUS landscape looks like?
I don't think so. I think that we are now at a 17-year high globally in M&A. The president, through CFIUS, in spite of himself, may find that the U.S. has a spectacular banner year. We're up, I just looked at the figures actually this morning. Britain, in spite of Brexit, is up, and Europe is up 200% on M&A within the first quarter. The U.S. is also up 67%. So I don't think investors or Chinese investors are deliberately investing in Europe. People forget that the whole foundation of CFIUS, when you go back to President Ford, was because of the Fairchild Conductor transaction, and that was with the acquisition by Fujitsu. So all of a sudden, we came to a knowledge and an awareness that we needed to be protected. Now I think it's being overcooked because we all became accustomed under Hart-Scott-Rodino to making those filings. Now we've got an additional definition of national security, which can be so broad as if we're not careful, it will inhibit us. And we can't construct the same wall with Mexico for M&A. In 2012, there was $385 billion, I believe, of economic inflow into the United States, and 140 CFIUS cases, 40% of all cases went to CFIUS. In 2017, CFIUS did not have the number of committee members to process many of the cases that we're going through due to delays in political appointees. So as I said previously, I think the president will claim victory for a great M&A year, and it will happen in spite of his process.
I actually have a bit of a different view to that. Our practice is, well, at the moment I'm advising a South Pacific government on a privatisation through to the Middle East. I do a lot of work in the Belt and Road, and we've seen a fire hydrant break loose of capital from China going through the Middle East and Africa very tactically. So, for example, this is on borders. Two great examples. China is using debt in Sri Lanka, establishing a port in the middle of nowhere, or it looked like it was the middle of nowhere. After it fell into trouble, they convert the debt to 85% equity and take a 100-year lease. That's 10 kilometres from the major shipping lane. 200 boats pass by today going to the Straits of Malacca, and this is this whole South China Sea. The amount of capital going into these sort of out-of-the-way areas at the expense of the US is considerable. And the second one is, say, in minerals. The President in December enacted an executive order protecting 35 minerals here. You hear of lithium and these sorts of things, but cobalt, and something that in due course I expect the lawyers will have to deal with. The Democratic Republic of the Congo produces, which you're probably aware, 60% of the world's cobalt at the moment. What you're probably not aware of is that 40,000 children are being used in mines, and there are huge grey markets of grey market cobalt being mixed with what looks like coming from proper mines. Imagine the impact on valuations. Imagine the impact on Apple having to give some kind of certification that its cobalt is not coming from mines using child labour. So the implications outside of your borders which are going to flow in are huge. And just because the Chinese have dried up here, another quick example, if you have a look at YAML, which is a LNG plant coming out of northern Siberia. The Russians control 40 icebreakers, the Chinese have commissioned 15, America has 2. You had one of your military stuck in a port in Montreal for 8 months. The Arctic Circle is opening up as well, again something that will impact upon your regulations and your availability to commodity in due course.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we have some time for people in the audience to ask questions should they want to. Does anybody have anything back here?
Well, if you look at the December executive order,
I was asking about strategic metals.
yeah, that's covered by it. It's to break down red tape and shorten the time life to mines because the US is so dependent on strategic metals. So the President enacted, I think it's 13817 in late December.
The Chinese want to have access to rare earths and strategic metals because they want to be a strategic technology leader, and they'll pay up for those. And probably irrespective of US regulation, I'm afraid.
There's
They're
been
gonna pay up to get it.
there's been a subtext that China and Russia, that both control significant rare earths, will form an OPEC-style cartel and sell to the rest of the world.
Do you have anybody else? I have one more. You mentioned earlier, Ewan, that even though Chinese deals have been a little bit slower into the U.S., you've seen a pickup in Japan. What does that look like? What sectors? Is there enough deal flow coming in to kind of compensate for the weakness of their neighbor?
The answer to his question is coming right now.
I think someone's sending me the Tunisia-England football result, which is a better place to be watching that than here. But anyway, look, I think Japan is a bizarre country. Actually, it's a fascinating country. It's got a population of somewhere approaching 300 million people, but that population is shrinking quite dramatically by over 500,000 a year. So it's not only an aging population, it's also a shrinking population. And it's an insular country. I come from the UK, where we're a bit crazy because we're an island, but the Japanese are even crazier because they're island people. They don't welcome immigrants, and they have been a closed country, historically a very innovative country, but suddenly now they're either halfway through a 40-year recession or maybe coming to the end of a 20-year recession. They've got to go out and grow outside Japan. So we're seeing very aggressive, and also, by the way, they have almost unlimited access to cheap debt capital today. So we're going to see very aggressive Japanese action, and I'm not sure they'll buy Rockefeller Center again. I think that has turned out to be a difficult acquisition for them. But I think the Japanese will be very aggressive over the next couple of years. And I'll be interested to see, as they become more aggressive, which is already happening, we'll be interested to see whether the political leaders in the US see Japan as an ally or as a strategic threat.
Oh, you have a question back there, actually, as well.
We've got, just as a larger view, there is an enormous amount of money in the Middle East that tied up in the sovereigns that they want to invest in U.S. infrastructure. Now, keep in mind, one of the drawbacks to that is it's a sovereign, one, so that's going to immediately trigger a review. And two, it's, they're talking about infrastructure. Well, what kind of infrastructure? And that'll be the next question. Does it meet the rubric of critical infrastructure? And in many cases it will. But the volume of money that is in is pretty eye-watering. And they're looking for some kind of clarity and things to settle out with respect to CFIUS and FIRMA and the regulations and all that. And I think there's going to be a significant effort to invest in U.S. infrastructure from the Middle East.
I'm advising a neighbour to Saudi Arabia at the moment, not Yemen, thank goodness. one of their ambitions is to create, as many countries have, some technology glide path to become the next Silicon Valley, and they have the money to do it. So what you find, if you wind back the clock and look at Singapore, when they've decided to do something, and they went after multimedia and a number of things, basically devised a very sophisticated grants program and threw money with great abundance and created success just by brute force. And I think that you will find in technology, Saudi Arabia is well placed. It has a rich history with the US. It has a cross-border influence. That type of area will yield many opportunities.
Well, so the Arab states are doing something I think is really interesting. They are. I totally agree with the comment that they're investing in their own infrastructure as well. They are getting very organised around security infrastructure. Their approach to security is dramatically more organised than the US approach to security.
That's not very hard.
You know, there are 129 different laws and regulations enacted last year in the US around reporting of data. 129 different laws. I mean, that's a profound level of complexity. In contrast, the Arab nations are getting much more organised. So UAE, for example, they will fund some of their neighbours' border security initiatives, metal detectors, data detectors, threat intelligence. They will fund it wholly, 100% funded by UAE, in exchange for the UAE being able to get a copy of all data that flows through those assets that they have donated to their neighbours. So I find it's very easy to underestimate what the Arab states are doing because they're far away and not very visible, but they are catching up enormously quickly. They're incredibly deliberate in their security strategy, and it's not just about oil, it's about physical security and cyber security as well.
I think what we're also finding is there's a huge increase in joint ventures and strategic partnerships. We have a client, for example, that has developed an anti-ballistics technology that's used by the military to shield its vehicles. And rather than export it from California, they're now looking at actually manufacturing. In the UAE, there are procurement rules also in those states that have been put into effect that actually are beginning to require domestic production, which helps a lot.
I think from a CFIUS perspective, there is a great focus right now on what are these regional ecosystems that are coming up, where you have a sharing of data between different countries and sharing of technologies and sharing of infrastructure and systems. And there's a great heightened awareness of what are the potential consequences of those types of ecosystems to the long-term national security interests of the U.S. Just one final point. In terms of the investments into Europe and the U.S., Europe is also setting up its CFIUS-like structures throughout Europe. Germany has just ratcheted up their structure, their system of review. Italy has one. France has one. UK has just started one. The EU is talking about certain initiatives. Right now, we're seeing more and more cross-border deals where, kind of following the trend that you saw with antitrust, it's not only just looking at US and Canada and their FDI review and ICA review procedures, but we now have to look at Germany, France. We had a transaction last year which not only triggered CFIUS, triggered an FDI review in Canada and Romania, because it turns out that Romania has a foreign direct investment review process. So there is a lot of that is now developing, and under the new law, there's going to be even more collaboration between these national security review processes.
Yeah, the new law even states if you're a NATO member, specifically calls out NATO or a close NATO ally, and you have a review process, and the U.S. government can look at it and go, okay, we have some comfort that this is an accurate process, you can actually significantly shorten or remove CFIUS from the equation.
The challenge there is going to be most of those countries are more export-oriented than the U.S. when it comes to national security issues. So it's going to be interesting to see how that's going to marry up.
Anyways, thank you all for such thoughtful questions, and thank you to our panelists.